The wind howled like a ghost through the torn metal walls of the wrecked ship. Ice covered the broken floor, and every breath Rylan took turned into mist. His boots crunched on frozen debris as he limped forward. Holding his side, blood had dried around the cut on his arm, but the cold made it numb. He had no idea how long he had been unconscious after the crash. Everything was dark, except for the flickering red emergency lights. The ship had fallen on an unknown alien moon. The system map was corrupted. There were no signals, no rescue beacons working, and worst of all, no heat. He was alone, or at least, he thought he was. Suddenly, a sound, soft but clear metal, sliding against metal. Rylan stopped, crouched low, and grabbed a broken pipe from the floor. His eyes scanned the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest. There was someone else in the wreck. A dim blue light glowed at the far end of the corridor, out of the shadows. A figure slowly stepped forward. It was a girl, no, not human tall, slim. Skin faintly glowing, eyes bright like stars. She looked young, maybe his age, and wrapped in thin thermal sheets. Her arms trembled as she hugged something close to her chest. Rylan didn't move, not sure if she was friend or foe. The alien girl stared at him, but there was no fear in her eyes. Instead, she took a slow step forward and knelt down on the floor. She opened the bundle in her arms, a sleeping bag. She placed it on the ground, looked at him, and then at the bag. Rylan understood immediately she was offering to share it, to stay warm. He hesitated. Confused, why would she help a human? The ship creaked again, snow pouring in from a cracked ceiling. The temperature was dropping fast, and he had no choice. Rylan slowly walked toward her. Never taking his eyes off her, he knelt beside her, keeping the pipe close, just in case. She did not flinch. She simply unzipped the sleeping bag and opened it wide. Inside, the lining still held warmth, and steam rose slightly in the cold air. She crawled in first, then looked at him and nodded. Still unsure, Rylan slid in beside her, leaving a small gap between them. The cold was less biting now, but his body still shivered. She reached out and pulled the zipper closed. Sealing them inside, for a long moment, they lay in silence. Then, the girl held up her hand and placed it gently on his chest. He tensed, but she didn't harm him. She pointed to herself and softly whispered, "Siri." Rylan blinked, then pointed to himself. "Rylan," he said, voice low and rough. Siri nodded once, her breath visible in the narrow space between them. There was something peaceful in it. Her face, though her skin was pale and alien, her expression was kind. Not a word more was spoken. But something passed between them. The wreck shook suddenly, and Rylan's hand shot to his pipe. Siri's eyes widened, and she placed her finger to her lips. A low growl echoed from somewhere deep within the ship. It was not mechanical, was alive. Rylan's blood turned cold again. Something had survived the crash, too. Something dangerous. Siri's hand found his in the sleeping bag, gripping tight. She was scared too, and now they were trapped together. The growling stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. Rylan's mind raced tiff. They made noise if they moved wrong. They could die. They both stayed still, breathing quietly, listening to the dead ship around them. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time had lost meaning. Then, slowly, the danger faded. The sounds stopped. Rylan looked at Sirish. She hadn't let go of his hand. He didn't pull away. In that frozen moment, the line between human and alien blurred. Two strangers, cold and alone, holding on to life and to each other. The cold was still there, pressing into Rylan's bones, but inside the sleeping bag, a strange warmth had settled, not just from the heat of their bodies, but from something else, something unspoken between them. Siri didn't speak his language, and he didn't speak hers, but somehow they were understanding each other, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. She shifted slightly, careful not to touch him too much. Though the space between them was already too small, her body was soft and light, and every time she moved, the bag rustled gently. Rylan kept his eyes half closed, watching her through. His lashes, outside the sleeping bag, the wreck groaned again. Metal twisting under pressure, snow falling through broken beams like silent ash. Somewhere deep in the structure, something let out a long, wet hiss. Ciri's hand gripped his wrist tightly, her other hand reaching inside the lining of the sleeping bag. Rylan flinched until he saw what she was pulling out. It was a tiny crystal, glowing softly blue. It flickered like a heartbeat, pulsing with low energy. She held it between them and pointed at it. Then at herself, and then at the wall behind him, her eyes serious. Rylan understood the meaning. This crystal powered something. Something that could help them. Maybe part of the ship, maybe a scanner, maybe a signal. But then Ciri pointed to her neck and made a slicing gesture. The message was clear. If they used it, it could attract danger. Rylan nodded slowly. His hand resting just near hers, he could feel her pulse racing like his. The crystal faded as she slipped it back into the small pouch sewn into the sleeping bag's lining. The two stayed there, close but silent, until Ciri leaned her head back and gave a tiny sigh. Like the air had finally softened around her, she closed her eyes. Rylan noticed something strange. Her skin was glowing less, fading into a softer shade. It was almost like she was dimming herself to conserve energy. She was freezing, just like him, but using her own body's natural light to stay alive. And now that she was safe beside him, she could finally rest. Rylan looked down at his bruised hand. The skin cracked from cold, and then at the girl beside him. He had never thought he'd find comfort beside someone not even human. But there it was, real and quiet. A sudden sound outside made them both sit upright. It was a scratching, not loud, but sharp. Something was walking along the outer wall. Rylan reached for the broken pipe he had left outside the bag, but Ciri gently pulled him back, her finger pressing against his lips this time. She reached into her side again and pulled out something else, a thin silver cloth. Almost invisible in the low light, she spread it over the top of the sleeping bag, and in seconds, the light dimmed even more. It was some kind of alien stealth fabric, hiding their heat, maybe even their heartbeat. The scratching outside moved closer, pausing near the broken door. Rylan held his breath, Ciri's hand still on his, fingers cold but firm. Then, silence again. Long and deep. Whatever it was, it had moved on. Ciri slowly exhaled, her shoulders relaxing as she lowered the cloth. Rylan stared at her, amazed. She had planned for this. She had survived this long because she was smart. Not just smart, brave too. She looked at him, her expression unreadable for a second. Then her eyes softened. She raised her hand and pointed to her side of the bag. Then gently patted the space closer to her. He blinked, unsure if she was asking or offering. But when she gave a small smile, he understood. She wanted to share more than space. Now she wanted trust. Slowly, he shifted closer, the warmth between them building, and for the first time since the crash, he didn't feel alone. Morning never truly came on that frozen moon. The sky above the broken roof was always dark and heavy, filled with swirling white snow that danced like ash. But something inside Rylan had changed. When he opened his eyes, Ciri was already awake. Watching him silently with her glowing eyes, she moved carefully, pulling out the glowing crystal from the sleeping bag again. This time, she reached under her arm and revealed a thin, flexible panel, half broken and flickering with lights. It looked like a survival map, maybe connected to old alien tech. She pressed the crystal into the panel, and suddenly, the map lit up. Blue lines spread out from a single point, their current location, and a green dot blinked far away. Ciri pointed to it, then made walking motions with her fingers. She looked at him with a hopeful expression. Rylan understood that place might be a shelter, maybe a working outpost or a supply pod. It was their only chance. He sat up slowly, pain shooting through his side. He gritted his teeth but didn't complain. Siri noticed, her brows furrowed, and she gently reached for his shirt, pulling it up slightly to look at the dark bruise on his ribs. He flinched at her touch, but didn't stop her. From a pocket inside the sleeping bag, she pulled out a small, pod-shaped container, opened it, and gently rubbed a glowing gel onto his bruise. The cold sting turned to warmth in seconds. Rylan stared at her. Surprised, grateful, she smiled again, just a little, then zipped up the bag. As if telling him it was time to move, they packed what little they had, just the sleeping bag, the stealth cloth, and the panel map, before stepping out into the icy corridor. Siri took a deep breath and looked back one last time at the place they had shared the night. There was no home here, only cold and shadows outside. Snow hit their faces like tiny needles, and the wind roared through every crack in the metal walls. They moved slowly, wrapped close together in the shared sleeping bag like a cloak. Every step was a struggle. The floor was uneven, covered in ice and rusted debris, but they pressed on, following the map's blinking green light as they reached a broken section of the hallway. Rylan saw something that made his stomach twist. A body frozen, bent backward, mouth open in a silent scream. Not human. Not alien like Siri either. Something else entirely. Siri crouched beside it, inspecting the suit and gear. She pulled a small canister from the body's belt, checked it, then handed it to Rylan. It was food paste, still sealed, probably weeks old, but edible. Rylan gave a soft laugh under his breath. For the first time in hours, he felt lucky. They shared a small bite each, sitting on a cold slab of metal, chewing in silence while wind rattled the walls around them. Then, from far down the corridor, a red light blinked, followed by a low mechanical hum. Siri froze, eyes wide. She grabbed Rylan's sleeve and dragged him into a side alcove. Pulling the stealth cloth over them, he barely had time to breathe when a hovering drone appeared, scanning the corridor with blinking sensors, the same kind used by bounty hunters and scavenger crews. If it scanned them, they were dead. The cloth shimmered, hiding their heat and signals. Siri held her breath, her hand gripping his tightly. The drone hovered closer, lights flashing. Rylan's heart pounded so loud he was sure it would give them away, but after a moment the drone drifted past, slowly disappearing into the dark. They didn't move for a long time, not until Siri lifted the cloth and peeked out carefully. The drone was gone. Rylan exhaled slowly. She turned to him, her face pale, then pointed at the map again urgently now. Faster steps, less time, more danger. Rylan nodded. They had to reach that green dot before night returned, or before something worse found them first. They stood again, side by side, in the snow-filled corridor. One human, one alien, and only one thin line of trust keeping them alive. The snow grew deeper as they reached the lower decks of the wreck. Every breath was harder now, their hands shaking, their feet numb. The corridors had collapsed in places, forcing them to crawl over fallen beams and squeeze through narrow gaps. Siri led the way, her body smaller and more flexible, helping Rylan whenever his injuries slowed him down. They found an old junction room, half buried under ice and rust. In the center stood a broken beacon tower, once used to send distress signals. Now barely alive, Siri pointed to it with a small smile. She tapped her map and then the beacons. Console, the green dot blinked faster. They were close. Rylan limped over and studied the beacon. It had a power slot, but no working cell. Siri took out the small glowing crystal from earlier and placed it carefully inside. The console flickered, buzzed, then clicked, lights turned on weakly. A weak hum began to rise, and the signal screen flashed red, then yellow, then steady green. Siri looked at Rylan and gave a hopeful nod. He smiled back, but then the beacon made a loud noise, a sudden beep that echoed through the wreck like thunder. They froze, eyes wide, far away. Something answered, a distant roar, deep and angry. It wasn't a drone this time. It was something big, something alive. Siri grabbed Rylan's hand and pulled him to a corner of the room. There she found a small, fire-stick cold alien tech designed to burn hot and fast for warmth. She activated it, and a blue flame burst from the rod. It lit the space around them, warm and bright. They sat beside it. Trying to catch their breath, Rylan watched the flame dance and whispered, "Why are you helping me?" Siri didn't answer in words. She reached into her coat and pulled out something. A picture, old and crumpled. It showed a group of aliens standing with humans, smiling. She pointed to one alien in the photo herself, but younger, and then to a man beside her, clearly human. Rylan stared, understanding slowly forming. He said quietly, "Family." She nodded. Her face soft, full of memory. Rylan didn't ask more. The fire between them said enough. Two survivors, both with stories, both with reasons to care. A loud crash outside shook the wall. They stood up quickly, fire stick in hand. The beacon was still active, the signal strong, but the danger had grown louder. Closer, they looked at each other and without speaking, knew they had to move again. But before they left, Siri pulled the sleeping bag from her pack. She tore a piece of it off and wrapped it around Rylan's injured leg like a brace. He winced, but nodded with thanks. Then she wrapped the remaining bag around both of them like a cloak again. They stepped out into the hallway once more, the flame lighting their path, but behind them, deep in the shadows, something began to move. It didn't crawl or hover, it stomped. It scraped, it breathed. Something was hunting them now, and time was running out. The hallway shook again, but this time it wasn't wind or the cold groaning of metal. It was something heavier. Footsteps that echoed, slow but steady. Siri pulled Rylan down behind a broken wall panel, the firestick now dimmed and hidden. Under her coat, they stayed low, breathing carefully. Eyes locked on the far end of the corridor. Then they saw it. A massive creature stepped into view. Dark skin like stone, eyes glowing orange, claws dragging across the walls as it walked. It was nearly 3 meters tall, hunched, sniffing the air. Not a machine, not a drone. This was a living thing, and it was hunting them. Rylan tightened his grip on the pipe he carried, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. Siri reached into her belt and pulled out a small glass sphere. Glowing faint blue, she held it up, looked at him, and pointed forward. Then up, then clenched her fist. He understood distraction, then run. She kissed the sphere gently and tossed it across the corridor. The moment it touched the ground, it exploded in a burst of light and sound. The creature howled, blinded, as Siri jumped to her feet and pulled Rylan with her. They ran through the corridor, slipping on ice, dodging debris. The monster roared behind them, smashing walls and beams as it chased. They turned left, then right, moving deeper into the wreck. Then suddenly, Rylan tripped and hit the floor hard. Pain shot through his side, the same injured ribs. Worse now, he gasped, unable to stand. Siri dropped beside him, trying to lift him. The creature was close, too. Close, its roar filling the air like thunder. Rylan looked at her and whispered, "Go." But Siri shook her head. Her eyes firm, her hands shaking but strong. She pulled the sleeping bag from her back, unzipped it, and wrapped it around him like armor. Then she stood, grabbed the firestick, and lit it again. The blue flame burst to life, and she faced the hallway. The creature charged toward her, roaring. Rylan watched helplessly from the ground as Siri raised the flame and screamed. A loud cry in her alien tongue. The fire caught the creature's face, and it howled in pain. Swinging wildly, she ducked, rolled, then stabbed the stick into its leg. More screams, more fury. But she bought them seconds. Rylan forced himself to stand, using the pipe for support. He limped to her, grabbed her by the waist, and together they escaped into a narrow shaft. At the side of the wall, the beast was too large to follow, its claws scraping the walls in rage. Inside the shaft, they collapsed, both panting, covered in dust and bruises. Rylan's face was pale, his body weak, but his eyes were still focused on her. She looked at his side and saw the blood. Fresh and dark. Without waiting, she opened. Her coat pulled him close and pressed her mouth to the wound. He cried out in shock. But she didn't stop. Her species had healing enzymes in their salivate, burned like fire. But it worked. After a moment, she pulled back, her lips stained red, her face pale. Rylan breathed hard, then slowly reached up and touched her cheek. "Why?" he whispered. She didn't speak, but leaned her head against his chest, eyes closed. They stayed like that in the dark, warm only from the sleeping bag. And each other, above them, the beast still roared, but it could not reach them. For now, they were safe. But Rylan knew one thing for sure. She had risked everything for him. And that meant they were no longer just strangers. They were something more. The tunnel was tight and narrow, filled with dust and old wires. Rylan's body ached with every step, but Siri never let go of his arm. She helped him move through the shaft, slowly and carefully. Behind them, the monster's roars had faded. But neither of them spoke. Only the sound of their boots crunching ice kept them grounded in the silence. After nearly an hour, they reached a metal hatch sealed with ice. Siri pressed her hand to the panel beside it, her fingers glowing faintly. A hidden scanner lit up and scanned her skin. With a long hiss, the door opened slowly, revealing a hidden chamber. Rylan blinked in the sudden light. Inside was a small shelter, old but still working. The power systems hummed, the air was warmer, and lights flickered across the walls. There was even a small heater and medical table in the corner. For the first time since the crash, Rylan felt hope rise in his chest. Siri smiled gently and helped him sit on the table. She picked up a healing gel pack from the counter and began to treat his ribs again. Her touch was careful, soft, and full of care. He looked at her and whispered, "You knew this place?" She nodded slowly, then pointed to the symbol on the wall, a crest of her people. This place belonged to her kind. Maybe a secret hideout, maybe an old science post. Just as Rylan was about to ask more, the main door beeped. They both froze. A red light flashed on the control panel, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching. Siri ran to the door controls and looked through the security cam feed. Rylan stood beside her, still weak. Leaning against the wall, what he saw on the screen made his stomach twist. It wasn't aliens, it was humans. Armed and armada, patrol unit, 3 soldiers, survivors like him. At first, he felt relief, but then he noticed their faces. Cold, angry, and alert. These were mercenaries, not rescuers. The door opened, and the men stepped in, weapons raised. They saw Rylan and paused, surprised. But when they saw Siri standing beside him, their eyes narrowed. "What the hell is that?" one of them said, aiming his blaster at her. "She's with me," Rylan said quickly. Raising his hands, "She saved my life." The leader, a tall man with a scar down his face, didn't lower his weapon. "Don't care. She's not one of us," he said coldly. "We've orders to secure tech, clean survivors, and kill hostiles." Siri stood still, not moving, but her eyes were full of quiet fire. Rylan stepped in front of her, his ribs screaming in pain. "You'll have to shoot through me," he said, voice shaking but firm. The room fell silent, the heater still. Humming in the background, the mercs exchanged glances, confused and angry. She's not our enemy. Rylan continued. She gave me warmth, saved me from a beast, treated my wounds. What did you do? The scarred leader lowered his gun just slightly. Siri took a step forward, unzipped the sleeping bag from her pack, and laid it gently on the table. It was torn, dirty, and burned, but full of meaning. She placed her hand over her heart, then extended it toward them, a gesture of peace. The youngest soldier looked uncomfortable, lowering his gun completely. But the scarred leader wasn't convinced. She's still one of them, he said. One kind act doesn't make her human. Rylan smiled faintly, tired but firm. Maybe not, he said, but it makes her better than you. Another moment passed in silence. Finally, the leader backed away and gestured to his men. Fine, he muttered. We leave at first light. As they exited into the next room, Siri looked at Rylan with soft eyes. He sat down slowly and gave her a weak smile that could have gone worse. He whispered. She tilted her head, clearly not understanding all the words, but she smiled anyway, inside the little shelter. Among the flickering lights and wounded hearts, the line between alien and human faded again. Only trust remained. Morning came slowly, but the snow outside never stopped. Thin sunlight leaked through a cracked ceiling panel, turning the ice walls golden inside the shelter. Siri was already awake, quietly folding the sleeping bag. Her movements were calm, graceful, like someone who had lived through storms before. Rylan sat nearby, ribs bandaged, body weak, but healing. He watched her, thinking how strange it was just days ago. They were strangers in the dark. Now, he couldn't imagine waking up without seeing her face. The warmth she gave wasn't just physical anymore. It was something else, something deeper. The mercenaries were packing up, too silent and cold. They hadn't spoken to Siri again, but they hadn't hurt her either. Her act of peace and Rylan's defense had changed something, even if just a little. Suddenly, the rescue beacon lit up. Flashing blue, Rylan stood, limping toward the screen. A human patrol ship had entered the atmosphere. It was real. They were being rescued. Siri looked at the screen. Then at Rylan, he smiled, trying to hide the sadness behind it. You're going home, he said softly, but she didn't respond, just tilted her head. When the ship landed outside the shelter, the doors opened with a loud hiss. Warm light spilled in, and humans in clean suits stepped out, shouting for survivors. The mercenaries rushed forward, waving for pickup, but Rylan didn't move. Siri stood beside him, holding the sleeping bag close to her chest. A female officer approached them, eyes narrowing when she saw Siri. But before she could speak, Rylan stepped forward. She's not a threat, he said firmly. She saved me. The officer looked at Siri, then at the torn sleeping bag in her arms. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. If she comes with you, the officer said, she'll be under your protection. Rylan looked at Siri, unsure what she would choose. Go back to her own people or stay with him. But Siri had already decided. She stepped closer to him, slipped her arm around his, and rested her head on his shoulder. No words, just action. They walked together into the shuttle, side by side, no longer just survivor and alien. Now something more, partners in survival, bonded by fire, cold, and trust inside the shuttle. Siri placed the sleeping bag beside them and leaned against Rylan. He wrapped an arm around her gently. The engines hummed, lifting them from the frozen moon. As the wreckage below faded into white mist, Rylan whispered, "We made it." Siri looked at him with soft eyes, then whispered one word, her first in human language. Together, and as the stars opened before them, Rylan realized something. The cold never truly left. But when you have someone beside you, even the darkest night becomes warm.